Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Lord of the Rings Tales from Middle-earth spoilers. So we're creeping towards the end of week 1 of Lord of the Rings spoilers, and we got some interesting stuff to talk about today. Some new treasure producers, and we know just how busted treasures have been in Magic. One of the most flavorful and maybe powerful sagas we've seen in a while, some ramp for mono red decks in Commander, and a counterspell that might be in the conversation for Modern. So anyway, we should probably jump right into it, start talking new Lord of the Rings cards. Before we do, 2 quick reminders. Number 1, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. And number 2, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Lord of the Rings Tales from Middle-earth. First up today, we get a super spicy and flavorful new saga in There and Back Again. So 5-mana red saga, first lore counter, up to 1 target creature can't block for as long as you control it, and the ring tempts you. Lore counter 2, search your library for a mountain, put it on the battlefield and shuffle, which is something we've actually never seen before in red. Red just directly ramping lands into play. And then the last lore counter, this is the big payoff. Create Smog, a legendary 6/6 red dragon creature token with flying and haste, and when this creature dies, create 14 treasure tokens. So a really powerful creature. Like 6/6 flying haste is good, and then that death trigger is a ridiculous amount of mana. So this is a very strange saga because the first 2 lore counters really aren't that good. Like 5 mana to make a creature not block for 2 turns, even with the bonus of the ring tempting you, that's like a panic spell bomb. Like that's an effect that should cost somewhere around 1 mana probably. So way overcosted. The ramp mode, as I mentioned, is super unique. The only mono red card I can find that ramps a land onto the battlefield is Alpine Guide, and that's temporary ramp. You get to search for a mountain, but then when it dies, you gotta sacrifice the mountain, and it has to attack every turn, so it's gonna die pretty quickly. So this is something new, although if 5 mana, ramping is like not super good. If this was a 3 mana saga or something with that ability, that would be something for Commander. At 5 mana, it's a nice little bonus, but not something that's really gonna be a staple, I don't think. So the big payoff is the Smog token, the 6/6 legendary flying hasty dragon that makes 14 treasures when it dies. That is a legit creature. If you think of comparisons for Smog, there's no super direct ones, but a 6/6 flying haster that's like a Chroma Angel of Wrath almost, and then its death trigger, Brass's Bounty, a really good dockside. It's an absurd amount of mana. However, there is a risk here. Because Smog only triggers when it dies, there are ways that you play this saga for 5 mana, you wait a couple turns to get the Smog, and it still goes wrong. Like if your opponent has bounce-based removal, like Cyclonic Rift, you're not going to get the treasures, you're not going to get the death trigger. If they have exile-based removal, like Anguished Unmaking, you're not going to get the death triggers, it's just going to go to exile. So I think that this card probably isn't good enough played fairly. Like if you're just playing a generic red deck in Commander, it's definitely not going to make it, I don't think, in like Modern or whatever. It's just really slow for those formats. Games are over by the time Smog would be hitting the battlefield most of the time. But let's say you're playing Commander. If you're just playing a generic red deck, is it worth it? I'm going to go with no. I think there's just too much risk and the card is too slow. On the other hand, there is a way to really get around these drawbacks, which is playing it in a sacrifice style deck. The easiest way to make sure that your Smog actually dies instead of getting bounced or going to exile is just have a way to sacrifice it. An Ashnod's Altar, a Phyrexian Altar. Maybe you're playing a legitimate sack deck like Corvald or Brian Stoutarm. In those decks, you make your Smog, you do your Smog stuff, and if your opponent goes to exile it or bounce it, you just sack it, get the 14 treasures, and it's even more exciting, I think, is a straight up combo piece. If you can add a token doubler to the mix, you can pretty much just straight up win the game. So you get the last lore counter, you get a Smog, but you're gonna get 2 Smogs because of the doubling season or the anointed procession. They're legendary, so you only get to keep 1 of them. So one's gonna die. That one dying is gonna make 28 treasures because you get to double your treasure tokens as well with doubling season or anointed procession. And then you can take and sack the other Smog and make 28 more treasures. I think 56 treasures. That is an amount of mana. It's not technically infinite, but it is so close to infinite that you should be able to win the game. If you want to go fully infinite, there is a card that does that in Vitu-Ghazi Guildmage. Vitu-Ghazi Guildmage, for 4 mana, lets you populate. Make a copy of a token of a creature you control. So once you get the Smog, you pay 4 mana, you copy the Smog. Again, they're going to legend rule themselves, so you lose one of the Smogs, but that Smog dying is going to make 14 treasures, and then you can use 4 of those treasures to Vitu-Ghazi Guildmage again, copy the Smog, make 14 more treasures for truly infinite mana. So I think that's the main home for this card. Just running it out fairly, I think it's a little too expensive, a little too slow, a little too risky, but in a sack deck or in a combo deck or a token deck, then this card becomes super frightening and potentially game winning. So I think there and back again, one of my favorite cards flavor-wise from the set. It's just a really cool design. I don't know, maybe people will play it more generically than I think. Maybe you can just throw it in any deck. My guess, though, is this is something for sacrifice decks and token decks, and in those decks, it is going to be ridiculously good. We also got a new blue instant in Borne Upon the Wind. So 2-mana instant, it says you may cast spells this turn as though they had flash and draw a card. So we've seen some similar versions of this in the past. It's kind of like Quicken, except Quicken only lets you play 1 spell with flash, and it has to be a sorcery. So you pay a little more mana for Borne Upon the Winds, but you get way more flexibility. It's very much like Emergence Zone, except Emergence Zone is a land and you gotta sacrifice it, which is pretty painful. But the ability to cast all of your things with flash for a turn can do some super cool things. So obviously the dream is and this is something Quicken can't do, but the dream is you're like playing a game of Magic, you got the Borne Upon the Wind, your opponent attacks you with something big, and you're like, haha, Borne Upon the Wind, flash Phyrexian Obliterating in play, block your thing, you gotta sacrifice all your stuff. That's stuff that none of these other versions, I guess Emergence Zone can do it, but again, you gotta sack a land, but a Quicken is not gonna do that. That's something unique with Borne Upon the Wind. One thing I did want to mention about Borne Upon the Wind, which sometimes confuses people, is casting spells as though they had flash is not the same as casting spells that have flash. So if you're playing like Slitherwisp, a creature that triggers to draw you a card when you cast a spell with flash, or maybe you're Errant Innigiata deck where you get to cast spells with flash from the top of your library, Borne Upon the Wind doesn't really synergize with these cards. You're not going to draw cards off of what you cast with Borne Upon the Wind with Slitherwisp. You're not going to be able to cast whatever off the top of your deck after you Borne Upon the Wind with Errant Innigiata because the cards don't technically have flash. You can just cast them like they have flash. So I think this card seems really good in a couple style of decks. One is decks that specifically care about casting multiple spells in a turn. Like, I think this is a Suramon card. You can cast the Borne Upon the Wind and cast any other spell, and that's going to trigger Suramon during your opponent's turn. So it's a little trick to make sure you can cast multiple spells during your opponent's turn. Same with like Jorian Ruin Diver. It also can let you combo off at instant speed, which is pretty sneaky. Like, if you're worried about your opponent having a counter spell, you can wait until your opponent's tapped out, and then Demonic Consultation, Thassa's Oracle, or then try to storm off with Vadrik at instant speed and, you know, cast your deck with Mind's Desire. Seems really cute with Leer. Like, Leer makes your stuff uncounterable and it lets you flash your stuff back so you can use Borne Upon the Winds multiple times. So I think those are some of the homes. Storm style combo decks, Spellslinger style combo decks. Also works well with Isochron Scepter. Put it on a Scepter and you can do this every single turn cycle. So you're going to be casting spells during your opponent's turn whenever you want to and drawing tons of cards. So I think Borne Upon the Wind, I don't know what its competitive implications are, but it seems like a really fun card to cast. The fact that like Quicken isn't really a staple, Emergence Zone isn't really a staple, that gives me pause that this is actually going to be like a busted card, but it does do some really cool, super unique things that not many cards in Magic can do. And at 2 mana and drawing you a card, it's actually pretty efficient. Apparently it's Spellslinger Day in Middle-earth, because our next card's another Spellslinger style card in Display of Power. So Display of Power, 3 mana red instant, can't be copied, copy any number of target instants and or sorcery spells. You may choose new targets for the copies. So the dream of this card is you're playing like a game of Commander and your opponent takes and casts a spell, and then another opponent in response casts another spell, and then someone else goes to counter something that's on the stack, and there's like 3 or 4 instants and sorceries on the stack, and then all of a sudden you cast Display of Power and you just get to copy all of them for 3 mana. That's the ceiling, and that's kind of how the card works. The cards that you copy have to literally be on the stack. The downside is it's kind of rare a lot of the times to have huge stacks. Sometimes in like control mirrors or like certain storm style combo decks it happens, but most of the time there's a spell on the stack and then it resolves and another spell on the stack. So you're gonna have to build a specific deck or be in a specific metagame to really harness its power. Probably the most hilarious thing this card can do, especially in 60 card formats, is the old Storm Reverserino kill. So let's say you're playing Legacy and you're up against a Storm deck and your opponent storms off and casts a ton of spells, and then they cast Tendrils of Agony to kill you, and they get a ton of copies of Tendrils of Agony. You just wait until all those Tendrils copies are on the stack, and then you cast Display of Power. You get to copy all of them, except you redirect them to your opponent. Yours are going to resolve first, your opponent's going to die. The same thing could happen in Modern. Like, Modern Storm storms off. They cast the huge Grape Shot that's going to kill you. In response, once all the copies are on the stack, you Display of Power and kill your opponent instead. So that is absolutely hilarious. It's maybe not the most effective way to stop Storm. Like, Mindbreak Trap just counters everything on the stack and it's free. So I'm not sure it's the most competitive way, but it's certainly the most hilarious way. One quick note, there is a bit of a timing thing here. So let's say you are up against a Storm deck and you got the Display of Power. Your opponent casts the Tendrils of Agony. You need to wait until all the copies go on the stack to cast Display of Power. If you wait until your opponent casts Tendrils, but they haven't put the Storm copies on the stack and you Display of Power, you'll get a copy of Tendrils, but you won't get all the copies. You won't get all the Storm copies because Storm triggers when you cast the spell, and you copying a spell is not casting a spell. So make sure to wait until all the copies are on the stack. Let the Storm trigger resolve and put them on the stack and then copy it. And that's how you get the whole Reverserino kill. Other things you could do with this card is you could use it in your own Storm style deck where it seems a little challenging to actually pull this off, but let's say you like play a Dark Ritual, and in response you play a Brainstorm, and in response you play a Seething Song, and in response you play a Mana Geyser, and then you cast a Display of Power with all those spells still in the stack. You get to copy all of those and use them all in additional time. I guess you can't actually do the Mana Geyser in response. You gotta play that one first because it's a sorcery, but still, you know what I'm saying. You could cast a bunch of spells of your own and then try to copy them all. The big challenge with that plan is it's just a lot of mana. Like, if you want a Seething Song and Brainstorm and Dark Ritual and then copy them all, you're looking at what, 8 mana just to do that? And if you add Mana Geyser into the mix, you're up to 13 mana. So you're gonna need a lot of mana for this to get going. So it's probably gonna be more practical to let your opponent do the work of casting spells and then copying their spells. Also worth mentioning, this is just a 3 mana red counter spell. Like, your opponent goes to mana drain your spell, you Display of Power, copying the mana drain, and then you change the target of the mana drain copy to the original mana drain. So essentially you win a counter war with this. Doesn't work as well against like creatures or planeswalkers. Like, that's not really going to do anything. But if your opponent's specifically trying to counter your stuff, this is a way you can kind of counter back out of your mono red deck. There's also some kind of funny things you could do with this in a format like Legacy. We talked about Storm kills like Rite of Flame. There's a mono red Storm deck, or like Fire Blast. Fire Blast you can cast for free by sacking 2 mountains. Imagine like getting to turn 4 in a game of Legacy playing Borne, and you like Fire Blast, sack all your lands with your mana floating, and then Display of Power to copy both the Fire Blast. As far as like Legacy Storm, I think the big problem is Bonus Round might just be better. Bonus Round kind of does the same thing of Display as Power, but you just get to cast it, and then everything you cast after it in the turn is going to be copied. Display of Power, you gotta literally have all those spells on the stack, which is a bit challenging to get going. So I don't know if it'll actually have like competitive Legacy ramifications. Could also see Modern trying it. In Modern, there's no bonus round, so maybe you could use it in Modern Storm where you just like cast a bunch of spells and then Grape Shot and then copy the Grape Shot triggers so you don't have to have as high of a Storm count to win the game. We've kind of seen Remand do this in the past. There's like a super old Modern Storm trick where you storm off in Grape Shot and get the copies, and then you remand the original, and then you get to cast the Grape Shot again to get even more copies. Display of Power kind of does the same thing, but even more efficiently and in some ways with more upside. So I could see Modern Storm giving it a try. So Display of Power, the ceiling of this card is ridiculous. The upside is huge. It can do hilarious things. On the other hand, normally spell copying effects don't really see a ton of competitive play in 60 card formats, so I'm actually a little skeptical this is like a competitive 60 card format card, but the fact that this can just copy everything can lead to some absurd stacks and game states, and I think it seems like a really fun card to build around, even if it might not be truly a top tier competitive card. Also, probably an easy inclusion in commander decks, especially Spellslinger Storm style commander decks. We also got a new Orzhov legend in Lotho Corrupt Shirriff. Sheriff, I guess? I don't know about that spelling. A 2-mana, 2/1 legendary halfling rogue. It says when a player casts their second spell each turn, you lose a life and create a treasure token. So this is a card that it's interesting. I guess its easiest comparison is like Monologue Task. Monologue Task does the same thing, except it doesn't trigger on your own spells, and it's on a 3-mana enchantment. You don't lose life either. It's a little bit like Council of the Four as well, where it cares about any player casting their second spell, so you can do it with your spells as well. Monologue Task, I actually think, is kind of a depressing example. It was a card that people thought might be the next Smothering Tithe when it was first spoiled, and it's turned out to be actually kind of fringe in Commander rather than a staple. So that makes me a little bit skeptical of Lotho. Like, is this actually going to be a really good card? On the other hand, everyone underestimated Ledger Shredder, especially for 60 card formats, and Ledger Shredder works essentially the same way. When any player casts their second spell, you get to connive, you draw and discard a card, and maybe grow your Ledger Shredder. Ledger Shredder has proven to be a staple back to Modern. Like, this is a really good card. I don't think Lotho is on that level. Like, it doesn't grow itself. It only makes a treasure rather than looting, so it's not filling your graveyard, it's losing you life, it doesn't have flying, it doesn't have as good of a body, it's only got 1 toughness. So I don't know, when you consider all the bad aspects of Lotho, I would be pretty shocked if it actually ended up being a Modern card. It's just not very big, and it's not very consistent, and it loses you life. On the other hand, this could be an interesting commander. So if you look at commander decks, treasures are really popular, and there's not really an Orzhov treasure commander. There's like Prosper if you want to play Rakdos, there's Agnes if you want to play Jund, but Orzhov doesn't really have a treasure commander, so this might be the default treasure commander for Orzhov decks, and there are some reasons to build a treasure deck in the Orzhov colors. You get Smothering Tithe, one of the strongest ramp spells and treasure producers in the format. You got Monologue Tax that we talked about before. You get some token doublers. So if you want to build like Orzhov treasures and taxes, Lotho is a pretty sweet commander for that deck. Outside of playing Lotho as your commander, I guess you could jam it in any Orzhov deck if you wanted to. I'm not really sure how good this will be. Like, an extra treasure every turn is a powerful effect. Like, we've seen that with Smothering Tithe. So maybe Lotho's good enough in that context. It is small, it does get wrapped away. Like, those are concerns. It's probably not going to stick around as much as Smothering Tithe. I think for sure there's certain archetypes that will really like this, even if it's not a generic staple, and maybe it is a generic staple in Commander just because ramping is so powerful, and this is a pretty powerful ramp effect once it gets going. People are going to cast their spells, and you're going to get the treasures for it. But I definitely consider it for party decks. It is a rogue, so it works with a party theme. Token synergy decks like Thales is perfect. Also a sneaky card for Lurrus decks. If you're playing Lurrus as your companion, this is another pretty powerful card that's going to be able to generate value and is cheap enough to work with Lurrus's restrictions. So very curious what you think of Lotho in Commander. My guess is just not big enough to really work in formats like Modern. In Commander, though, is this an archetype staple? Is this something you just jam in any deck because making treasures is really powerful? Do you need more of a theme to build around it? Let me know what you think about this one, because I'm really on the fence at just how good this will be in Commander. Speaking of treasures, we got another treasure legend. This time I read one in Gloin Dwarf Envoy. In this one, I think this one got killed by a certain sneaky restriction, but a 3-mana 3/3 legendary dwarf advisor. It said when you cast a historic spell, which are artifacts, legends, or sagas, create a treasure token. This ability only triggers once each turn, and then you can sack a treasure to go to creature, so it's got attack but can't attack you. I think that once per turn restriction really hurts this card. If it didn't have the once per turn restriction, this card would be very powerful. I think this would potentially be a new Commander staple. There might even be some conversations to be had for playing in specific decks in 60 card formats, but with the once per turn restriction, I'm just not sure it's very good, and I actually wonder if they even needed to add that restriction. Like, if you look at Stormkiln Artist, it doesn't have that restriction. Just whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, you get to make a treasure, and theoretically, it's easier to chain together a bunch of instants and sorceries and a bunch of historic spells. Or look at other historic payoffs, like Teshar or Joyra. They don't have that restriction. Jory just draws a card whenever you cast a historic spell. Teshar just reanimates a cheap thing whenever you cast a historic spell. So I'm actually kind of surprised that this card has the restriction, although I guess there has been a lot of complaints about the powers of treasures, and Stormkiln Artist is a legit frightening card. It is a you must kill this. If we let you untap with this, you're probably going to storm off and win the game style of card. So maybe it's for the best that Gloin is powered down a little bit, but I think the fact that it has that restriction makes it a pretty fringe card. For 60 card formats, it seems cute in Magda decks. Not that Magda decks are real anywhere, but it really works with the theme. It's a dwarf. It makes treasures for Magda's ability. It makes treasures with Magda because it's a dwarf. It gives you another way to use your treasures by goading things. Could also see maybe trying it in Bard class decks. Like Bard class, you got a ton of legends. That's kind of the whole gimmick of the deck, and they are all historic spells. So as you're casting your spells on the cheap and drawing cards with Bard class, you're getting these bonus treasures. If you've ever seen like Bard class go off with a Burgee on the battlefield, Gloin can kind of do a similar thing, although again, Burgee keeps making that mana every time you cast a spell. Why this is only going to make 1 mana a turn, so even in that context, it just might not be good enough. As far as Commander, I think there's 3 potential homes for this card. First, Goad decks. And in Goad decks, I'm actually pretty confident this is going to be worth it, because Goad is a relatively new mechanic, and it's still sort of under-supported. There's just not that many cards that goad. So if you really care about goading, because you're Furkrag or Baloth or Karazikar, then I think Gloin is worth it, just because it's another good enough card that works with the theme of your deck. I also think it's going to be really good in Dwarf decks. Dwarfs, similar to Goad, it's a tribe that's been around a while, but it's not very powerful. So anytime you get a new rare Dwarf, it's going to be in the conversation at least for Magda or DePaula, just because there's not a lot of options. The final possibility is in treasure decks, Prosper or Agnes or whatever. These are actually the decks where I'm least convinced that it's going to make the cut because of that once per turn restriction, but it still works with the theme of the deck, and maybe it's still good enough. So Gloin, the card's interesting, it's cool, but that once per turn restriction makes me really skeptical that it's going to see play anywhere, especially in 60 card formats, but I think it even really powers it down in Commander too. So it might be one of those cards that, because of that restriction, just doesn't actually quite make it anywhere. In the world of lower rarity cards, we got a couple of interesting ones. Shadowfax, Lord of the Horses. People love this card for some reason. 5 mana Boros, 4/4 legendary horse. Says horses you control have haste, and then when Shadowfax attacks, you can put a creature card with lesser power from your hand on the battlefield, tapped and attacking. So Shadowfax, for being an uncommon legend, it's not bad. I think the big thing is there just really aren't horse legends. So now you have 2 options if you want to build horse tribal. You can be Bill the Pony mono white horses or Shadowfax Boros horses. So I think that by itself is a big deal, essentially. Just the fact that this tribe that hasn't really had a legend to lead it in Commander now has multiple options is super sweet. Although beyond that, I mean, it's a janky meme tribe. I think that's where horses live in Magic right now. So not going to be broken or anything like that, but it does give players an option to build a new tribe that they just really hasn't had support before. On the other hand, we also got Stern Scolding, which I think is supposed to be one of the modern cards from the set. So 1 blue mana instant, counter target creature spell with power or toughness 2 or less. So how good is countering a creature with power or toughness 2 or less in modern in specific? And the answer is, if you look into the cards that actually see play in modern, it's actually quite good. So I went through the top 50 creatures in all of modern, and it turns out that 5 of the top 10 creatures get countered by Stern Scolding, 10 of the top 20 creatures get countered by Stern Scolding, and almost 30 of the top 50 creatures get countered by Stern Scolding. So this is 1 mana stop, let's say half of the best and most played creatures in modern. That's actually a pretty powerful effect when you consider that stopping Ragavans and Shardless Agent and Ledger Shredder and Seasoned Pyromancer, Solitudes and Griefs. On the other hand, much of the time it's going to be the same as a removal spell. Like, if your opponent plays a Ragavan, you can Stern Scolding it on the stack, or you could Unholy Hate it on the battlefield, or Fatal Push it on the battlefield. Where this logic falls apart, though, is with ETB creatures. Like, sure, you can Fatal Push Grief, but Grief has already kind of done its damage. It's already Thought Seized you. You can, use Unholy Heat on Seasoned Pyromancer, but it's already looted and made some tokens. So with these ETB-style creatures, Stern Scolding is actually a pretty solid answer. So I think Stern Scolding actually has potential to be a pretty popular modern card. Whether or not it can make it in main decks right now, that's another question. So if you look at the metagame in Modern, out of the top 8 decks in the format, 4 of those decks are Indomitable Creativity, Crashing Footfalls Cascade, Mono Green Tron in Living End. Against any of these decks, Stern Scolding is pretty much unplayable. Like, it's going to be the worst card in your deck. It doesn't really do anything against any of these decks. So the fact that half of the top tier of the meta just doesn't care about it probably means Stern Scolding is more of a sideboard card. One other quick note on it, this is one of those cards that's way better on the play than on the draw. If you go back to our big list of creatures as counters, Ragavan's probably the easiest example. If you're playing first, you get to counter it with Stern Scolding. On the other hand, if you're on the draw, Stern Scolding gets a lot worse. Like, your opponent goes first, they land Ragavan, you untap, you play your land, you get a Stern Scolding, but you're already getting snowballed by the monkey. So it might be one of those cards where, because of the current meta, and also because of the play draw concerns, it might be mostly a sideboard card. I think in the right matchups, which is like half the popular decks in Modern, and if you're on the play, this is going to be one of the stronger cards in your deck. On the other hand, if you're on the draw and you're up against one of these bad matchups like Tron or Indomitable Creativity, you just really can't have it in your deck. It's going to be a literal dead draw. So I think at a minimum, Stern Scolding, I think, can be a sideboard all-star in Modern. The other thing to consider too is just how much removal are in your colors. Like, could you play this in an Is It deck? And I'm actually not sure. Like, if you have Unholy Heat and if you have access to Lightning Bolt, do you need Stern Scolding, or is it just worth it to play something that's a little more flexible, doesn't have the timing restriction of a counter spell? So I guess we'll have to wait and see. But if you're a deck that struggles with removal and then you're in the right matchup, this is going to be a really, really solid card. So I think sideboard all-star at a minimum, and in the right meta, it could be a Modern main deck card. Finally today, a couple more uncommon legends that could be cheap build-arounds in Commander, maybe in Brawl, and then just a bunch of draft style stuff, which you can check out all the lower rarity stuff over at MTGpreviews.com. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Lord of the Rings spoilers for today. So what do you think? What's your favorite card of the day? Can the new treasure cards make it in 60 card formats? Are they more Commander things? What about Stern Scolding? Like, is that good enough for Modern? Is it main deck? Is it sideboard? Is it not good enough at all? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back tomorrow with more daily Lord of the Rings Tales from Middle-earth spoilers. So until then, have a lovely day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, make sure to check out the video about the most miraculous top deck in the history of Magic the Gathering. Or maybe the Against Odds, where we try to build the saltiest historic Brawl deck possible, just to see what'll happen.